Okay, so welcome back. This is the last module for week 6. So, we will continue our discussion on the biological treatment. So, we were talking about some of the basics of biological treatment in the previous module. So, let us continue that discussion. So, in terms of biological treatment, one I mentioned to you that there are essentially two, aerobic and aerobic. In the aerobic, we call it a composting process. So, what is a composting process? So, in this particular slide, we will try to explain what is composting, like in very basics of composting. So, the composting process, it has been happening in nature always. It's going on in nature, like you go on outside. There is always some sort of biodegradation happening. You go in the woods, you go into the like a forestry kind of area, you see a lot of biodegradation and other things are going on. So, but in terms of the composting that we talk about, in terms of getting into the food waste, agricultural waste and those kind of waste stream, essentially what we are doing is we are taking this waste stream which is which has this proteins, amino acid, lipids, carbohydrates, cellulose, lignin and some ash content. Then you supply oxygen to it, you supply some nutrient if needed, microorganisms needs to be there. So, what this does is these microorganisms use this as a food source, and that is your main, like a carbohydrate kind of a main food source over there. Carbohydrate, protein and other things are there as well. And so, they use it as a food source. They produce new like bacteria, they produce new microorganisms. The old cells die, so they produce new cell, and then the old cell dies, and then the old cell also becomes part of the compost. So, it is basically a set of microbial activity. At the end of the microbial activity, you get a humus material called compost, and the new cells that are produced become part of the active biomass. So, you have the active biomass which is involved in the conversion of organic matter, and when they die they become part of the compost. So, that is how the cycle works. You produce CO2, you produce some water, nitrate, sulfate, and then some heat is also released. Aerobic composting is an isothermic reaction, as not endothermic. Isothermic is when the heat is released. So, that is why many times compost systems, especially in the summer months, we have a issue of sometimes compost piles catching on fire, because usually these gases, none of these gases will actually catch fire that easily, but they do catch fire because there will be some pockets of anaerobic activity going on, and so some methane will be produced, and that methane, when it gets at a very high temperature, because of the exothermic reaction, the temperature goes up, and when it goes to flammability range of methane, you start seeing some fire coming out. So, that is how many times you see that fire going on top of the dumps or top of the compost pile. That is the reason why it happens. So, compost essentially like a very simple way. You have you have your food waste or organic fraction of municipal solid waste, supply oxygen, supply nutrients, some microorganism, and you get your compost produced, new cell produced, and there will be dead cells which will become part of the compost, some gas released, and endothermic is the exothermic reaction. So, you have some heat released as well. So, that is in terms of some like a very simple description of how this composting is done. Composting, in a big cell, how the composting is done. Typical flow diagram for a commingled commercial composting, where you have everything commingled MSW coming in. So, there will be a collection vehicle which will where waste will come in the receiving area. Then you have a front load loader. There will be a manual removal of material. You have bulky items, white goods, cardboards can be taken out. Then there will be another manual removal of recyclables, where this paper, glass, metal cans can be taken out. Then you have conveyor, where it goes to the primary setting, get like broken down into smaller pieces. Then it goes for magnetic separation, where they remove the metals. Then to disc screen, where to take the oversized material out, magnetic separation, and mixture, you mix with water, nutrients and other additives just to make it good enough for your compost. Then from this point you basically come over here, and then you have plug flow compost reactor where the reaction will take place. There will be some maturation time, the use of trommel screen to save it, and then you have a pneumatic conveyor in terms of tertiary, cyclone, baghouse, and all those things are there in terms of air pollution control system. So this is a typical flow diagram for commercial composting, and depending on what kind of waste you have, if you have a source separated organics only coming in there, so you can skip many of these steps on over here, because you are just working with source separated organics. You don't have this you don't have this ferrous metal, you should not see any glass showing up and all those kind of stuff. So this is again typical flow diagram for a commercial compost. And then we have nutrients. Nutrients are also very important. Nutrients are kind of vitamins that we take. So it helps into keeping the system running. So the most critical environment factor of composting is the relative portion of carbon and nitrogen. You don't want too much of a carbon and nitrogen ratio. The optimal range is between 20:1 and 25:1. So that's the range in which it works, 20:1 to 25:1. And then composting time increases with increase in carbon nitrogen ratio. If you have above 40:1, it becomes really difficult. There are some so if you look at the individual components of organic matter, they have different carbon nitrogen ratio. Some sludge has a low ratio, 15:1, while yard waste has a very high ratio. Newspaper again has a high ratio. So what we do is to get the optimal ratio, many times what the organic waste is blended together. So you will have a few of the organic waste which is blended together to make the waste in the carbon nitrogen ratio between 20:1 and 25:1. For example, we might add newsprint, which is high in carbon, low in nitrogen, yard waste, which is high in nitrogen, and supplement with manure, which is if needed, which is in the range of 50. They have the carbon nitrogen ratio of 15:1, or sludge again 15:1. So they can be added to get optimum carbon nitrogen ratio. So that's again a very important point. Next is our in terms of carbon nitrogen ratio, just a carbon nitrogen ratio of selected compostable material. Again, this table is coming from the same book that we mentioned yesterday, in the earlier videos, where this is from the Subangula's integrated waste management book, very old book, but again has a lot of information there, and these numbers does not change that much anyway. So in terms of the food processing waste, manure, sludge, wooden straw, paper, yard waste, biomass, this is the percentage nitrogen, and this is the CN ratio given to us. So if we know the CN ratio, we know the percentage nitrogen, of course we can calculate carbon. So that's kind of just to give you an illustrate that there are carbon nitrogen ratio or CN ratio is available for many of the waste, waste component, many of the food, many of the components from the organic fraction or municipal solid waste. So it's this data can be used for doing our math exercise and all that, and we'll do that when we do some math associated with this chapter. So in terms of some of the math problem now. So in terms of you have, if you are working with different waste streams. So if you are running a compost plant, you will not be only dealing with one type of waste, because many times you will have people bringing in different types of waste, and now you are trying to find out that in what ratio you should mix them so that you get an optimum carbon nitrogen ratio. So if you look at say if you have leaves and sludge, you had leaf from certain part of there was a big storm, and then a lot of leaves came down, and so you have this big truck full of leaves, and then you have some sewage sludge. Carbon nitrogen ratio for leaf and sludge has been provided, 50:1 and 6:1, and the water content as well as nitrogen content is also given. So once we know this, now it's asking that what is the mixing ratio per 1 kg to get a carbon nitrogen ratio of 25:1. So if you take 1 kg of leaf, moisture content is 30%, So the dry matter will be 0.7 because 1 minus 0.3, and nitrogen. So it's nitrogen is what it says 0.7%. So 0.007. So that's what you see over here. 0.007 times 0.70, and then you get a nitrogen value of this much. So once you know the nitrogen value, we know that CN ratio is 50. So 50 times the nitrogen will get us the carbon. So this is how the carbon nitrogen ratio can be calculated. Same thing for the sludge. Water is 0.75 kg. So the dry matter is 0.25. Nitrogen has been given as 5.6%. So based on that, we can calculate how much nitrogen, how much carbon. So that also gives us like a carbon at like a percentage carbon present, percentage nitrogen present, so that we can use those in our calculation. So this is like one example of that. And then if you continue that, take 1 kg of leaves and x kg of sludge, we don't know yet. So how much sludge, how much leaf will be needed. So let's take 1 kg of leaf and add x kg of sludge. The desired carbon nitrogen is 25:1. So we can say we are doing what we are doing here is just the simple mass balance. So all the carbon is in numerator and all the nitrogen is in the denominator. So carbon in 1 kg of leaves plus x times carbon in 1 kg of sludge. So that will be like how much sludge needs to be mixed. Then and then for the nitrogen, it's nitrogen in 1 kg of leaves plus x times nitrogen in 1 kg of sludge. So if you do this math and then you come up with x is equal to 0.47. So what does this mean? It means that you need 0.47 kg of sludge per 1 kg of leaves to get a optimum carbon nitrogen ratio of 25:1. So this is was an example to illustrate that you can calculate, if you know the individual carbon nitrogen ratio and individual quantity, you can calculate the carbon nitrogen ratio of the mix. And you may have to do it when you try to do your compost or anaerobic digestion or all those kind of treatment methods using bio or microorganisms. So that's kind of important on that part. Then check the water content. Once you have this the carbon nitrogen ratio, you know that you need 0.47 kg of sludge per 1 kg of leaf. So but what about the water content? Because we need certain amount of water as well. So check the water content for 1 kg leaves plus 0.47 kg of sludge. So water we get around 0.653 kg water is there, and the dry matter is 0.818 kg. So in terms of the water content, mass of water divided by the total mass of the system. So mass of water is 0.653 and total mass is 0.653 plus 0.818, which are these two numbers which came from there. So this is this number and this number. These are the two numbers we have, and those numbers. So we add these two up. That gives us the total mass of the system, and this is the mass of water which is present there. So based on that, if you look at it's around 44%. So 44% is the moisture. For the compost, typically it says that you try to have around 50%. 50% because the microbes, they really love moisture. They do love moisture, and they do their work much better if it's a moist. So for the 50% moisture content, we need to add some water. So we can also calculate how much water we need to add, and those are pretty straightforward. So for the water that you need to add, check the water content for 1 kg leaves plus 0.47 kg of sludge. So here we are 0.5, that should be the water content. So here total, if you are going to add x amount, so the weight of water will become 0.653 plus x, and the total weight will become 1.471 plus x, because that's the so this, based on that we can calculate x, and x is 0.166 kg of water. So we can add 166 ml of water per kg of leaves. So that's it's what we can do. Also we can look at bulking agent, we can look at, do we need to add wood chips, do we need to add some crushed tires, inert material, bulking agent for the increasing the porosity of the compost, for air movement, calculate the air pollution control system. Those things needs to be done as well. So In terms of bulking agent we use to increase the porosity of the compost. Why we need to increase the porosity of the compost? Because we are supplying air. So when we are supplying air, the air has to pass through the compost to get the reaction done. So for that, for the air flow, if a good porosity will help actually in terms of the air flow. So that's where it's important to have a good porosity. So these are some of the calculations that can be done on that aspect. So that's in terms of the math on this part. So this is just to give you illustrate. So this is again how as a compost, if you are running a compost plant and you are interested in you are running a compost plant and you are interested in getting various waste stream, because many times you will not be working with only one waste stream. So you will have municipal solid waste, you may get some garden waste, you may get some agricultural waste. So how to calculate a optimum carbon nitrogen ratio for these variable like different types of waste stream. For each of the individual waste stream, you will know carbon nitrogen ratio. If you don't know it, you should find it out using that CHONS analyzer. Most of the labs in good universities have it. So that's give us the carbon and nitrogen content. So once we have this carbon and nitrogen content for individual, based on optimum carbon nitrogen ratio that we require, we can always do our proportion of in what proportion we need to mix our different components. So that's basically tells us like as if you're running a compost plant, how to go about that. So these are again very important. When we do any composting in India, we have several compost plants were built, and some of them are still working, but many of them actually could not work for a longer period of time because of some problem or the other. So that's why we need to be really very thorough in terms of the design of the compost plant, at least from this point onwards. Compost as a technique is being used globally. It's popular. It's more popular in the rural areas than in like a high density urban area. But again, if you want to go for this composting, if we have the source separated organics, that's actually very good. That's helps us a lot. But if you cannot have a source separated organics, then of course the compost quality will be bad. And we have to come up with ways of how to get these inorganic fraction, those plastics and other things out of the compost. Otherwise, your compost quality goes down. It will not sell at a higher price, and if it doesn't sell at a higher price, your plant will not be self-sufficient over a long period of time. Again, the subsidy can only get things started. The plant has to be self-reliant. Then we should look at and these things can be made self-reliant. It's just that we have to do it properly. So, and these kind of calculations should be done in terms of when we try to go for design of this compost system. So, being said that, there are other parameters there as well. We will talk about some of those other parameters where temperature plays a major role in terms of like a degradation. As you know, like the bacteria, they work at they like certain temperature. They don't like too cold and they don't like too hot either. So that's why if you remember from your BOD test, that the BOD test is done at 35 degrees centigrade. So there is a reason for doing it at 35 degrees centigrade, because that's the set of bacteria which we want to do our job in the BOD test. They are very active around the 35 degrees centigrade temperature. So we have to be careful in terms of temperature. And so heat is released in the composting process. So when the heat is released in the composting process, the mass of composting material will retain the heat. It will get warm. The temperature is caused by the exothermic reaction, which is associated with microbial respiration. High temperature is essential for destruction of pathogenic organisms. So in high temperature, you have pathogens getting destroyed. Composting operates in two temperature ranges, mesophilic and thermophilic. Mesophilic is 30 to 35 degrees centigrade. So we try to work at 30 to 35 degrees centigrade in first few days to get the things working in a mesophilic range, and then we take it to a thermophilic range. That's around 50 to 60 degrees centigrade for the remainder of the time. In the thermophilic range, around 60 degrees centigrade, if you keep it for 24 hours, will destroy all pathogens. Remember, you are working with waste. So when you are working with waste, you may have some pathogens present, and those pathogens needs to be destroyed before you sell those composts. So it has to, and we test for those as well. So it should be kept below 66 degrees centigrade. We want it above above 60, but we don't want it above 66, because if you take it above 66, your most of this biological activity reduces significantly, because the bacteria starts to die. So you don't want it above 66 degrees centigrade. So so that's to maintain the high temperature, the compost it can be controlled by airflow. If we in static piles, temperature is controlled by airflow. In the windrow, the temperature does drop for several hours after mixing, and then it again picks up, because of the isothermic reaction, heat is also produced as part of the reaction process. Then the other important factor is do the pH control. We have to control the pH. Why to control the pH? Because mesophilic range pH is around 7 to 7.5, which if you initially like after you try to keep it in the neutral pH. Once the waste starts degrading, if it starts producing some organic acid, pH will naturally drop to 5. It will go down to 5 because of the organic acid, but and then during thermophilic range, pH will rise to around 8. So that's pH does fluctuate. During thermophilic stage, pH will rise to around 8. To minimize, but we don't want it to go too further beyond 8, because if it starts getting beyond 8.5, this nitrate, nitrogen, remember we are trying to have an optimum carbon nitrogen ratio. Nitrogen is needed in our fertilizers as well in the compost. So if you have too high of a pH, so if the pH goes beyond 8.5, what is going to happen is your nitrogen, it gets converted to ammonia gas, and then this ammonia gas escapes the system. So we don't want that to happen, otherwise we are losing nitrogen, and we need nitrogen in our compost. So we try to keep pH below 8.5. Again, as I was telling you in the previous video, don't try to memorize these things. These things are, everything which is out there is there because of some reason. So try to understand the reason why we need to do the pH control, because this bacteria, they like the neutral range, but once the acids are produced, there will be pH will go down a little bit, but you don't want it to go down too below, say below 4 or even below 5, too much below 5. That also becomes problematic for many of these bacteria. And then we don't want it to go beyond 8. There will be some in thermophilic, when during the reaction the pH will go back up, but we don't want too much beyond 8, otherwise we are losing nitrogen as ammonia gas. So we have to manage this pH, and that's done using some sort of we do the aeration. And then we don't like to add lime, because if you try to add lime, it causes nitrogen to be released as ammonia gas, because lime is it's a basic which causes and then ammonia will be released, and which causes a smell problem and reduction in available nitrogen. So your compost quality is going down. Match your compost once the composting is done, when the reaction has been taken place, they have a pH of around 7. And but if you don't have a proper air supply, if its anaerobic system gets developed, your pH may drop to 4.5, and then once it's dropped to 4.5, your compost system will struggle. So it's not easy to keep it working. So you may have to sometimes restart the whole composting process. So you don't want that to happen. So you don't let pH go below 4.5 in a compost system. So temperature is important, pH is important, moisture content is important, amount of organic fraction which is there is important, and then the temperature and pH also has certain relationship here as well. So as the time of the day, once you start this composting process, you see that this is a kind of temperature range, like how based on the reactions that is happening, you start seeing a built up of temperature, and then the temperature goes down. This is there are two lines where line bottom and the top, and the one in the middle is showing us like it's basically the range. The gray portion is the range of temperature range and the pH range. pH, again, as you can see over here, we had certain dip in pH, and that dip is pH is because of the acids that is being formed, like acetic acid. So here if you try to kind of drag a line, it's around 5 point something. So it's not a perfect line, but you can put a scale and do it. It will be around something around 5 point some will come up. So it's so pH does go down, but then it will start back up. So this range is when actually this pH around 7.5 to 8.5. That's the pH range which bacteria really likes. And once the composting is done, we will have the pH kind of go down to around 7.5. That's what the typical pH you will see. So this is just showing you a temperature and pH profile of a typical composter, of a windrow composting, and that's in terms of how the temperature and pH will change over a period of time as the composting process is taking place. So there are some other environmental factors. The moisture content, we kind of talked about that a little bit here, should be range of 50 to 60% on a weight basis. When we say weight, it means taking the moisture content into consideration. So when we talking about it's when in the wet weight is basically mass of water divided by the total mass where the mass of water is also included. So that's your wet weight basis. So high moisture content, you don't want too much moisture content, because if all the pores have been filled up, if all the pores have been filled up with this water, you will not be able to pass air through it. So if you remember, say these are the let's see, we have this is the waste, different components, and so in between we have these void spaces. So let's say this is I'm trying to, not a great artist, but in between, as you can see, there are some let's use different color. So in between we have these void spaces here. These are the void spaces. Now if we fill these void spaces with moisture, now next we will not be able to pass air through these. So it will be already saturated. So that's why we don't want high moisture content displaces air from the pore spaces. So we don't want too much high, but around 50 to 60% is what is helps in terms of, because the bacteria likes water. Without water, bacteria will not survive. So it does need water to survive. Then you may do some blending and seeding. Blending means where the organisms are necessary. So if you don't have, so what we do is we mix 5% of partially decomposed compost. So it's a partially decomposed compost. It's a good population of the bacteria present. So we take that 5% partially degraded compost and mix it at the front. So if this is your composting process where the waste is actually coming in here, and you have some partially degraded compost over there, so we take part of it and put it back in here, and that helps in terms of bacterial population coming back here. Again, sludge is a good source. Sludge is also used for getting a good bacterial population. Particle size, again, if you have too big of a particle, it becomes difficult. So we try to shred it to 25 to 75 mm. So that's the particle size for this 25 to 75 mm. Exposes more surface area, allows for easy airflow. So it helps in that. Then you do the mixing and turning, prevents drying, caking or air channeling when you try to do the mixing and drying. Frequency, it's again you do it in a certain interval. First turning we do after 3 days, then after every 5 days we do the turning. So that while doing turning, essentially what we are doing is we are trying to add air. We are mixing air to the compost pile. So these are some of the environmental factors which goes in there. So there are some other environmental factors in terms of the oxygen requirement, which can be calculated from the following stoichiometric equation. So we'll continue this discussion is from this particular slide, because this slide will take a little bit of time for us to talk about, and we are kind of end of this video around 30 minutes duration. So but essentially what we need to do is first we'll talk about that in terms of how to get this equation, and this equation is for the BVS portion. So, we need to get this equation first. So, once we get this equation from the stoichiometric, how much oxygen will be required, how much CO2 will be produced, how much ammonia will be produced, and all those calculations can be done. So, we'll talk about that in more detail in the next video. So, that will be actually week 7 video number 1. So, with that let's conclude this particular module, and we'll start from this particular slide again. So, again like we have been re-emphasizing, re-emphasizing every time that use the discussion board for any problem you have, anything we can help you with, and do the quiz, and you can take the exam at the end of the class. So, any questions, anything, feel free to contact us through the discussion board, and I hope you are enjoying the course, and I look forward to continuing the next half. Now, actually this is the end of week 6. So, half of the course is done. Now, we have another half left. So, which will cover these treatment systems, landfills, disposal part, and then we'll go into C&D and e-waste component for last few weeks. Okay, so thank you, and looking forward to seeing you again.